Our meeting with the karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei mauri ora. No mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. Please let me or the Democracy Advisor know if you intend to leave the meeting. We'll be aiming for morning tea about 10:30. Lunch is not provided today. We shouldn't need it. We should be done. Apologies. Are there any apologies for this meeting? There appear to be none. Any conflict of interests to declare? No. So we will move on to the minutes. I will move and Councillor O'Neill will second the minutes of our meeting from the 15th of August. And we will put those to a vote. Ka whakapoa ki au, kua mana te motini. I declare the motion carried. There are no items not on the agenda. We have two public participants today. The first being Oliver Mander on behalf of the New Zealand Shareholders Association. No, my Oliver, and you can, the air is fine as long as you've got a green light on the mic and you have 10 minutes. And if you want to leave any time for questions as part of those 10 minutes, thank you.
Well, kia ora tātou. Thank you very much for allowing me to have the opportunity to speak today. My name is Oliver Mander. I'm the Chief Executive of the New Zealand Shareholders Association. Just a couple of quick things on NZSA itself. So we are a non-profit body. We look after the rights of investors and we support investors and fair capital markets in New Zealand. In this context, however, I just want to highlight our values. What we are is independent. So I don't have anything to sell. I'm simply an independent body that can provide support for any investor or shareholder. We are evidence-based, we are outcome-focused, and essentially we look to form objective assessments around issues that affect shareholders. I guess my comments today relate to the sale of Wellington Airport shares. And I speak in the context of Wellington City Council as a key shareholder in that business. At the moment, you have a shareholding in a single asset, in a single city, and it operates in one sector. So if we think about the core principles of investment, that presents a significant risk for the council in terms of how it utilises its funds. And therefore, by extension, that forms a risk for the ratepayers of Wellington City. So from our perspective, we believe that it is in the interests of the council and of its ratepayers for the council to sell its shares in the airport and to utilise those funds to invest in a globally diversified investment fund that benefits the city and its ratepayers for the long term. I know that there's perceptions around that. I know that a lot of people, and we still hear the legacy of the bad old days of the 1980s and 1990s in terms of investing in New Zealand. But I can assure you that investing for the future, investing for the long term, it is not gambling. It is actually a way of ensuring that the council can provide for future generations and support intergenerational investment in its own future and for the future of its residents and ratepayers. Since 2003, despite the various shocks that have been popularised in the media, such as the GFC, COVID, the financial crises during that period, so in the 20 years since 2003, the value of investment markets has tripled. Now, it would be very difficult to say that the same has occurred with the investment in Wellington Airport. The average growth over the long term for investment in equity markets is around 8% per annum. So by the magic of compounding, that means that they double at least every 8 or 9 years or so. So you certainly have a significant long-term benefit through providing for investment into a future, into a globally diversified, appropriate set of funds. I know that some of you may be concerned about the release of so much cash for the council. One way to protect the interests of future residents and future ratepayers is simply through looking to have that cash governed by a group of independent trustees and to ensure that some form of trust structure can be set up with Wellington City Council and its ratepayers as beneficiaries. So that actually means that you are keeping an arm's length relationship for the future use of those investment funds. It means that those funds are not necessarily available to everyone straight away, and actually means that trustees can determine the amount coming back into the city, and then that forms a budget, a rateable budget for the city to use in future. That is only one suggestion, of course. There are bound to be other brains far better than mine who will offer better advice in terms of how to utilise those funds for the benefit of future generations. That is really all I wanted to say. I would love to receive any questions or comments on what I've said today.
Thank you, Oliver. The first one is from Pauiwi Hohaia.
Thank you, Oliver. Just a quick one around the risks that you mentioned.
Yep.
Do you have a view on the risk associated with the potential for a capital call on investors associated with the airport?
If you're investing in a single specific asset, the risk of a capital raise, that is something that investors are well used to dealing with. Your risk may be heightened by investment in a single asset, such as the airport. I don't have a view on whether the airport itself will have a need to raise capital. We do note the recent capital raise for Auckland Airport. In fact, that was announced last week, I think it was, and that did carry risks for individual investors. And I think we commented in the media at the time because of the structure of how that capital was raised. As it turned out, Auckland City Council, as a partial owner of those shares, chose not to participate in the capital raise. That meant that their shareholding was effectively diluted. So that is a risk if you're an investor in an individual asset in an individual company. Certainly, if you were looking towards a more diversified global investment, capital calls, capital returns, so it goes the other way too, they do occur, but that would be left to the discretion of future governors of that investment fund, your investment committee, if you will. When capital raises happen, it's often in the interests of individual investors to participate to avoid that dilution. By being diluted, you are lowering the value of your future investment. You're lowering the opportunity to upside that capital will generate in future.
Thank you.
Councillor Free.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Do you think that, how can we actually better communicate some of these important concepts to our communities? Have you got any ideas about how we can actually, because I agree with you, but how can we actually get this message out more effectively than we've done so to date?
So that is a very interesting question. I'm not a financial advisor, I'll state that very clearly, so I cannot give financial advice to any individual or anybody myself. But this is less about financial advice and more about education. It's actually how we can get more commerciality, more investor capability driven across the New Zealand population more generally. Now, that's the broad concept, and certainly that's a key part of what I aim to do in my role longer term. However, for the council specifically, I can say that I'd be very happy to play a role in helping to put together some of those key investment principles, if that helps your communications teams. But I do see it as a key role for council to actually educate itself and thereby extension its ratepayers on those core investment principles.
Thank you.
Councillor McNulty.
Yeah, I'm just interested with your perspective as an investor. The modelling that we have is that if there is a catastrophic event in Wellington, that the residual value of the airport is $0, that there is no one in the world willing to step in and come in at a fire sale price and invest in that asset should we face a catastrophe. Do you think that's a fair assumption that there is no one globally that would be willing to step in that situation?
So look, I haven't seen the same research that you have been, but if that's what your modelling is telling you, it sounds like a plausible outcome. It highlights that risk that I'm trying to bring to this meeting in terms of the council as an investor in a single asset in a single city in a single class. Certainly, if you look in a New Zealand context, an investment in Auckland and Christchurch airports would, as the two major airports in the country, the two gateways, we're a small country at the bottom of the Pacific. I would agree with the assessment that were a catastrophic event occur, that investment in those two other airport assets will probably be of more benefit to New Zealand generally.
Councillor Calvert.
My question's already been answered, thank you.
Councillor Brown.
Thanks. Oliver, in terms of this issue of diversification, it seems to me that the KiwiSavers are growing quite rapidly. I think they were up like 20 billion or something in the last 12 months. And the overall value of funds has increased very markedly. And the Reserve Bank figures, I think, show over 300 million now invested in 300 billion, I should say, invested in funds. But are we seeing New Zealanders move away from direct ownership of shares to a more fund-based model? I mean, is that so? In other words, individuals are actually voting with their money to actually go this diversification route as opposed to specific share ownership. Is that a sort of an overall trend?
So the short answer is yes, and we think that's a benefit to New Zealand and investors generally. And it's actually great to see a product like KiwiSaver have mass take-up in New Zealand, because what we've got is a situation where more New Zealanders are becoming more exposed to global markets and actually have productive investment available to them. There's no longer the property is still a very key component for most New Zealanders, and I would still argue there's an unconscious bias for most individuals to gravitate towards property. But the exposure provided through KiwiSaver has certainly heightened Kiwis' consciousness about how they invest and what they're invested in. So yes, we are seeing that trend towards funds. What we often see with larger investors, or I shouldn't use, it's not just size, it's more sophisticated investors, they will choose to maintain a balance between active direct investment in a portfolio of New Zealand or Australian assets or investments, and then they will also operate ETFs or funds that may be listed or unlisted in global markets to give them the exposure that they need globally. It is worth noting that the New Zealand share market is 0.2% of the world's global market. The US is closer to 43%. So certainly it makes sense for New Zealanders to be invested offshore.
Even though we are out of time, we'll have one more quick question and quick answer from Councillor Abdurrahman.
Kia ora, Oliver. I have the Constitution of New Zealand Share Associations right here in front of me, 10 pages. In that, there is an objective of the associations, and you're representing the association today. And which part of that association are you representing and advocating when you come here and speaking on behalf?
I'm sorry, I don't follow the question. Sorry, the New Zealand Shareholders Association, we represent all investors and we advocate on behalf of all investors, regardless of their investment products that they hold. We do intend to prioritise public markets because that's where we can make the most difference. So we don't represent, I don't represent corporates, I don't represent the New Zealand Stock Exchange, I don't represent anyone else.
I think we're out of time. Thank you so much, Oliver. We appreciate you. Thank you. Our final public participant is John Swan. John, you have 5 minutes, including time for questions if you would like.
Councillor Matthews, could I just ask for a minute or so people can bring up item 2.2 on their addressing issues directly.
We're on the clock, John. That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. I'm here to talk about item 2.2 of the agenda, which contains a proposal from the CFO as to an annual plan directive and approach. The CFO and her financial personnel are attempting to ensure the transparency of material to form part of the next annual plan, and they have also acknowledged that there will be a deficit arising from insufficient revenue against projected operating expenses of the council, and the existing long-term plan has enabled debt to be used to fund those operating expenses in the event that there is insufficient revenue. These intentions form the classic road to a bankruptcy, which will come as no surprise to a few around the council table and should be readily recognised by its auditors. And it will come as no surprise to the coalition government, who have already signalled their concern as to the financial deterioration caused by continuous reckless expenditure on non-core nice-to-have projects. In previous submissions to this committee, I've identified those non-core items that must be controlled, and I've been consistently ignored. What cannot be ignored is the content of item 2.2 of today's agenda. The CFO in item 7 of the officer's recommendation has identified 3 outstanding issues that amount to significant uncertainties and risk, and the ability of the council to meet its current and future obligations without resorting to further debt. The problem there is that the city is hard up against its recently increased debt to revenue ratio of 225%. But the Mayor and the CEO have a cunning plan to enable further debt to issue, to enable current work plans in Civic Square and other capital works to continue, including development of the eastern end of Civic Square, which was discussed at last week's infrastructure meeting. More of the city's silver is to be flogged by way of the sale of the airport shares. It's expected that a further sum of $225 million, calculated but not substantiated, will come back onto the balance sheet of the city, destined for the significant event insurance replacement fund. But this sum conveniently lowers for a period the debt balance and enables the further funds to be borrowed to keep the city afloat. That is why the Mayor and her cohorts are desperate to liquidate the last investment asset the city holds. The obligation of each councillor is detailed in item 17 on page 111 of the papers. Item 18 lists objectives that must be seen to be observed if the city is to be managed effectively and its solvency is to be maintained. Councillor Nera, the Mayor and councillors must be aware of these obligations, both now and at the SGM to be called on the 10th of October to authorise the sale of the shares. The obligation is to the ratepayer and the citizens of the Wellington. There is no obligation to the Mana Whenua or to the Green or Labour parties. Councillor Brown should provide independent evidence that he is not conflicted in whatever decision he takes on the sale issue. The word of the retiring CEO does not cut the mustard. The sale must not be authorised. The long-term plan must be reviewed and consulted upon to ensure that the risks and uncertainties identified in agenda item 2.2 are evaluated and credible steps taken to pause all non-infrastructure capital expenditure while this properly moderated and informed review takes place. The sideshows of the Mayor should cease. The city is being ridiculed as a result of her volatile behaviour. The 2025 annual plan directive should not be accepted by this meeting until all the uncertainties identified have been resolved and properly accounted for.
You're out of time. Thank you, Mr. Swan. We now move on to item 2.1, the Development Contributions Policy Report back on consultation and final version for approval. Nau mai, Sean Ordain, me Michael Duandam, ki te horo I te kōrero. Please welcome Sean and Michael to introduce the report.
Good morning, councillors. Before you is our report back on the Development Contributions Policy. The Development Contributions Policy is a method for which we levy a fee for growth in the city. It only applies to growth. It cannot be used to fund services for existing residents, and it is only levied on the portion of infrastructure that is used to provide for that growth. So essentially, it is how we account for new houses being built in the city and the networks that they connect to. It has already been, the development contributions was notified before the long-term plan and has been consulted on. The paper before you contains the amendments that have been made based on that consultation and its reasoning. Thank you.
Are there questions? Yes, Councillor Young.
just like Councillor Panovich, who's looking very short over there. Just with the development contributions, are they ring-fenced to cover the costs for which they are intended?
Yes, so you will see there are schedules of projects. Development contributions are apportioned to those projects. They cannot be spent on anything else.
Great, thank you.
Hope that's the last comment on people's height, Councillor Young. Councillor Brown. or lack thereof, speaking for myself.
I understand that the government have established this committee under Stephen Joyce to sort of look at infrastructure funding in growth areas. Is that going to have consequences in terms of, the council funding growth infrastructure and doing developer contributions? I mean, do we know what the government policy is in this area?
So government policy is still under formation. We have, however, received communications from ministers, as have everybody, we're not special, that growth will pay for growth. We're yet to see what the details of that actually means, but it would imply that an approach that is similar to the reasoning that underlies development contributions will be employed and will probably be extended.
Thank you. The one thing which was sort of lacking for me in the paper was a breakdown of it. I think you said $4.7 million of levies last year were raised and a couple of million the year before, but I didn't quite know where that actually come from. But do we try and make sure that each of the areas that we're levying, so I mean it was quite granular, the way the levies are actually calculated, that they are actually related to explicit costs in those areas? And given that in some areas obviously there's sort of no development and no levies, how good is the nexus between the income we get out of this and the actual spend that we're doing? Because I think the average spend in the papers indicates about $19 million a year expected over the next 30 years. Obviously, I don't know what the expenditure is in the current sort of period.
To answer the first part of your question, Councillor, the information I provided around the income received was only recently available, particularly the last financial year. So there is a record of DC income that we received because we invoiced that. We've got an invoicing system that records that. In terms of that causal nexus that you talked about, in terms of where developments are happening and then what they're paying for and how that's accounted for, the LGA does require us to demonstrate in our policy that there is a causal nexus, so there is a direct relationship between the growth, where it happens, and then what they're levied. And depending on where that growth happens, which is really difficult to predict, there will be different fees relative to the type of infrastructure that's needed to support that development.
I forgot what my question was.
we can come back to you, Tim.
I'll come back, sorry about that.
Oh, yeah, Councillor Brown. Sorry, Councillor Rogers.
Yeah, and I noticed in a couple of the submissions there were specific developers who had raised concerns around, again, specific developments. I was wondering if, in your analysis of delaying the DCs, whether you found a more appropriate tool to address each of those issues, whether we could do it on a case-by-case basis or something similar rather than re-changing all of the policy?
Yes, so there are a few submitters that raised concerns about whether particular projects should be considered as citywide or whether they should be a catchment-based charge. That was reevaluated as part of looking at and analysing the submissions and then making recommendations on changes to the report. What we found through evaluating those submissions is that there were some justifiable changes that needed to be made to the policy, and those have been recommended. So, for instance, Best Farms, which does a lot of development in the north for Greenfield, identified some concerns that they had around water charges and whether they were fairly reflected, and they made a good point. Officers went back and made some changes to reintroduce those catchment charges, and as a consequence also introducing some catchment charges across other parts of the city. So there's sort of a redistribution of sort of costs that really probably aligned with what was already in the 2022 policy. So I guess that's an example of good consultation and reflecting on that. In terms of different options, no, there weren't really a lot of alternatives. Going back to my answer to Councillor Brown around that need to demonstrate the causal nexus, there has to be a direct relationship between the demand that a development's putting on the network and then therefore our ability to charge for that. So that's why we have the recommendations in the report that are before you today.
The only thing I'd add is within the policy itself, there are a couple of mechanisms where that causal nexus is proven to need some more local refinement, and those are through developer agreements and remittance policies.
Yeah, my other question was around, I guess, particularly some of the research that the Infrastructure Commission did and some of the work that they're now working on in terms of growth paying for growth. Would a delay in part of the development contributions perhaps send murky price signals to developers about the best way to efficiently develop across the assets that we have?
So there's two high-level things to consider. One is that we have significant infrastructure costs in the city, and this is revenue that is specifically tagged to address those infrastructure problems. So there is a decision that you need to make essentially around, are you going to charge the growth of the city to the people who are part of that growth, or is it going to be borne by ratepayers? The second part is around certainty. The longer you wait, the more vulnerable you become to legislative reform and changes within the system. Now, as I have constantly said, the law is the law until it is not the law, and the speed of the law is tied to the speed of official understanding, so it can be a little difficult to predict. And that is something that you'll have to bear in mind is as you come towards the next LTP and that growth infrastructure is factored, will you be looking at going from a situation where you have remitted, where you have deferred DCs to then a higher DC regime or not?
Cool, thank you.
Councillor Randall.
Yes, I mean, I think you partly addressed this, but I just wanted to ask why, of all the different areas that have been catchmented, most are catchmented either to be citywide or to be catchmented to the Granada Lincolnshire Farm catchment in the north. And I was wondering why for example, the parks and transport for Central City and a city are being designated to be citywide. Thinking, for example, Thorndon Quay is designated citywide, while the transport and parks projects for the north, the development in the north, are not shared citywide.
So there's two sets of reasoning that sit behind that. One is development contributions are most effective in a greenfield setting, and so that is why you generally find more DC catchments in those northern suburbs because you're dealing with more greenfield up there. Within the central city, there is generally more apportioned to citywide infrastructure because of the nature of the central city as an employment hub, and you have residents moving through those environments through either arterial routes or they're using it during the day when they're at work. So at a high level, that's the reason for those splits.
I'd just elaborate on that. So in terms of how the policy's formed and the modelling that sits behind it, what activity managers in the council have to do when they're putting their programs together to come to you for LTP decisions, they're having to identify who's going to benefit from that investment. And so as part of that, they'll identify, is it a catchment? Is it a citywide? Is it multiple catchments? And that's the information that then goes into informing things like the development contributions policy. So in terms of who benefits and how that's identified in the development contributions policy, that's really reflecting the decisions that have been made through an LTP process and at an individual activity level.
Okay, so just to confirm, that means that people who are purchasing houses in these greenfield areas in the north are through the developer paying for both their local parks infrastructure, but also the parks infrastructure for the rest of the city?
It really depends on, so yes is the answer, and then in terms of the citywide contributions, those are where it has been determined that there is a broader citywide benefit for those particular assets, and that would apply to things like community facilities as well, which have a wider city benefit.
Okay.
So there is a split.
One last question. Should any party wish to challenge a specific charge, is there a process after we confirm these, assuming we confirm this report, is there a process under which they can challenge that and perhaps get it adjusted if they have got good grounds for that under the criteria?
Yes, Councillor, there is. As Sean mentioned, there's also an opportunity for developers to do a deal with the council in terms of looking at developer agreements, and that's certainly been the case in the north, where developers have provided infrastructure on behalf of the community, and that might be in their interest so that they can jump ahead and deliver development before the council had signalled in its LTP they were going to deliver it, or they might feel that they can do that cheaper than the council, and the same goes for roads. Those are arrangements that have already happened in Wellington City previously. The other thing also is in terms of challenging the base fees, once the policy is set. However, there is also an opportunity through the Local Government Act, which is reflected in the policy, where they can challenge the DC fees, and then there's a formal assessment process for that that involves commissioners and the like to look at the legitimacy of the challenge and then make a determination. And if they want to and they don't agree with the decision of that process, that can go to the High Court.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Mayor Fung.
Yeah, just in paragraph 49, looking at the Greenfield DCs, ours are comparatively low compared to the rest of the country. So is there a plan to stagger an increase to the Greenfields over time?
So this is an apportionment exercise. So similar to the way that the value of a home is used to divide up the cost of the LTP effectively. Similarly, the equivalent housing units, so the growth is used to divide. So if you wished to make that number go up, you would need to provide more infrastructure for growth in which to divide that number by.
So just to elaborate again, and to go back to an earlier answer to Councillor Brown, the way that the apportionment of costs works is that it has to be relative to that investment for a particular asset that's in the LTP. So if you've funded a pipe or a road or a park and it costs a certain amount, that's how the fee gets divided. And so it's not possible to inflate the amount of fees that a particular area can be charged. They have to be relative to the costs that have been identified and scheduled in your LTP.
Yeah, you're not really able to use this mechanism as a behaviour change mechanism.
Exactly what I was angling at.
Councillor Calvert.
Yeah, thank you. That's just prompted a question for me. In terms of, because we have very little in our LTP for growth in our water infrastructure, so that is essentially why the development contributions aren't covering any funding for growth in our water infrastructure, because we haven't got any plans for it. Is that essentially it?
That is the case, and to address that in light of the new district plan, there is a spatial planning exercise which you voted on at the Environment and Infrastructure Committee. As part of that, we are working quite closely with Wellington Water and the other infrastructure providers to quantify that, and that is designed to lead into your next infrastructure strategy and long-term plan process. And at that point, you'll be also looking at the development contributions again.
Okay, so and are you assuming that would be for the next LTP iteration?
That is my current planning.
So essentially, we passed a district plan without providing for the infrastructure to support that district plan. From what I can or in terms of water anyway.
So the important thing to understand is the district plan was never designed to see the full development capacity used within the next 30 years. No district plan in the country has ever been passed with all of its infrastructure provided for. The question we have now is we must provide the market certainty to developers and to homeowners that the infrastructure will be there to achieve your housing aspirations. And we must also do so to provide the long-term stability for the rating system.
But we probably won't be able to do that for another 3 years in terms of any increase in development contributions to fund water infrastructure growth.
Yes, that's what's reflected in the infrastructure strategy that underpinned the LTP. So it identified that we're able to meet our legal requirements under the NPSUD to provide for housing bottom lines.
Okay.
It also signalled that there are some challenges ahead in terms of meeting that medium and long-term growth need, which is why there will need to be some additional infrastructure to support future growth. But the immediate requirement on the council is to ensure there's short-term capacity to meet projected demand, and the infrastructure strategy demonstrates that we can do that. It will be a challenge in the medium to long term.
Yeah. But that's just targeted a
Councillor,
couple of areas.
that's
isn't it?
3, so if you come
I've got
through
that
me.
on the-
Thank you, yeah, of course, happy to. Councillor Free.
Yeah, I'm sorry if this is a silly question because I don't totally understand the stuff. But are you saying that we can't really include developments as part of our DC calculations until we actually have concrete plans or firm plans to spend that money?
So essentially what we need is a line item in your LTP or your infrastructure strategy that has the degree of certainty and rigour necessary to demonstrate to developers that we are going to build something.
Yeah, so they don't want to pay for things that might just maybe happen. They want to pay for things that are pretty certain to happen.
Yes, it has to be certain.
Like in the next 3 to 5 years sort of time frame rather than further away.
So generally, yes, there are some longer term items that have that degree of certainty attached to them. The other thing to bear in mind is once you begin to collect for a project, if you then cancel that project, it must be remitted. And given the, shall we say, the flux of the construction market, administratively that's actually quite difficult to do.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That does help.
Councillor Brown, you've remembered your other question?
Yes, in fact, I even remembered another question. So I've got 2 questions. One is, it relates to the new owners of the Shelley Bay, whatever's going on in Shelley Bay. I understand that they've paid for a sewerage pipe from Shelley Bay to connect into the sort of the main trunk, so to speak. Is that the sort of option that all developers have? So they could either pay a developer contribution or they could actually build the infrastructure themselves? I mean, how does that sort of thing come about?
Yes, so they can contribute the infrastructure, as Michael was saying.
Right.
So instead of taking, say, $10 million, we may take a street.
Right. Okay, so if you're doing a development, they can actually look at the infrastructure that's associated with that, and they can say, well, we'll look after this part of it. And
yeah, and that effectively forms the developer agreement.
Oh, okay. And my other question is around the remissions/rebate type policies. Do you have any idea of how much that is actually handed back, if you like, over the last couple of years?
No, I don't have that information at hand.
But is it something which is sort of regularly used, or is it there as an idea but it doesn't actually get a lot of use?
I don't have that information at hand, sorry.
That's okay.
Councillor Calvert?
Yes, so I just want to find out, just in terms of the short-term growth that we've allowed for, so is those the areas of the central city, Tawa, Johnsonville? Are those the areas, or are there others?
So yes, those are the areas.
Newtown, sorry, as well.
Those are the areas, but there is also growth capacity in places like Karori. It is not to the 6-storey limits that you see in places like Tawa, but there is still intensification allowed in those suburbs.
Okay, so but that's been provided for growth in those suburbs in terms of our long-term plan?
So yes, as Michael said, during the infrastructure strategy that assessment was made,
Yep.
and we have the headroom necessary for the short and some of the medium term, but it is also beholden on us as your advisors to make sure that we enable you to make the decisions to secure the long-term future.
Thank you.
Councillor Brown, I just wanted to check. So, councillors, you may have noticed you've had an email from Councillor Brown indicating that he wishes to move an amendment. I want to check, have you got a seconder? I don't need to know who it is, but have you got a seconder? Okay. Okay. And if you're happy to, councillor, we could take questions on your amendment now and bring it up on the screen.
Well, could I ask the experts
Doesn't he have
here?
to move them? Sorry, Chair. Doesn't he have to move it first before the question?
No, I'm happy to chair the meeting, and sometimes we do questions if we have an amendment, so we do it all as a group.
Oh, okay.
So,
that's interesting.
Could I ask your views about this? I mean, is it disruptive, if you like?
well, first of all, I want to bring your amendment up.
Oh, sure.
This will be easier if I can see the words.
Oh, you wrote it.
And probably I would have started, Councillor Brown, with just some advice, general advice on the amendment. Thank you.
Yeah, could you provide some general advice to the amendment?
A lot of backseat cheering going on.
So the amendment is to delay the increase of base levies in the, fees in the central city until the 1st of July 2026. What you are looking to do is essentially forgo revenue until the 1st of July 2026. Might be a little bit longer if we have to factor it into the annual plan process for that year. And the question for you is essentially, are you willing to forgo that revenue for infrastructure or not?
I have a question, which is, does this amendment, is it likely to have an impact on the numbers of properties that are developed in the inner city, or is it essentially a subsidy on properties that were already going to be developed?
It's a really difficult question to answer, Councillor. I guess the feedback that came through the consultation phase, there were developers that said that it would affect the viability of some of their developments, having fee increases. As an officer, it was really difficult to verify that without having the information at hand. So, it's really difficult to understand what the impact could be. But in terms of the numbers, and when I was looking at in terms of development that has happened in the city over the last 20 years, what the trend lines were looking like, that it was quite consistent, and that relative to the projections that we've got, there doesn't seem to be at least any obvious sort of impact in terms of development contributions. It appears to have a relatively insignificant impact on development, and certainly relative to what we see in other jurisdictions, the fees are quite low. But on an individual development level, that they may be impactful, and they may have an impact on viability. So I have to give a generalised response because I don't understand the impact at an individual property or development level.
But that impact on an individual, the viability of an individual development, we have other mechanisms through which we could address that.
Yes, we do. In the development contributions policy, there is a remissions clause. So that provides the opportunity for developers to come to the council and put a case forward for having a lower fee. There's a negotiation that would go on as part of that. It's delegated to the CE, and I believe, I'll just load it up so I'll give you the correct wording.
Well, Michael does that. Essentially, if you're looking at the higher end of the property market, no, I don't see that DCs would be a determining factor because the unit prices are already so great, and so you're looking at a smaller percentage. If you were looking, however, at the first home buyer market, where LVRs and interest rates and incomes are more sensitive to impact, then yes, I can see that there may be an impact from this. However, the other thing you'll need to factor is if the income does not come to us from development contributions, it will be another pressure that is applied to your rate.
Did you have those?
I do. So that consideration for remission, the policy details that would sit with the Chief Executive Officer in conjunction with the Chair of the Regulatory Process Committee. So there's political and officer level involvement for that decision making, and they provide an opportunity to analyse the impact and make a determination about the extent of remission.
Thank you. Councillor Calvert.
Any idea how much this would cost us over this period?
Once again, that's quite difficult to predict because development in the current setting isn't what it used to be, and things can change quickly with interest rate changes and things like that. But based on the Housing and Business Needs Assessment projections for development, which has underpinned your LTP, I project that it would probably have a financial impact of $3.3 million over those 2 years if it was to be delayed. That assumes that we get the amount of growth that we're anticipating.
So can I just challenge that?
No.
Oh.
You can do it as part of debate if you want, or you can ask another question. I can put you back on the list. Councillor Randall.
Oh, hang on, I just haven't finished.
Okay, sorry, Councillor.
So 3.3%, that's operational expenditure or
Sorry,
income?
$3.3 million.
3.3 million, that's operational income, revenue?
So development contributions, that's borrowing, and so the development contribution fees are to go back to pay for things like interest costs and the borrowing that's been done to invest in infrastructure.
It's basically paying back your CapEx cost.
Okay, so it's OPEX, so that would be close to really a 1% rates increase. It's about
can I
4
just
million?
check with the chief accountant? Would that be OPEX or CapEx? I'm a town planner, sorry.
So any development contributions offset the borrowing that we undertake to complete the works that it's being contributed to. So in effect, the operational cost will be the cost of that borrowing that you would incur. So, you know, it's not operational expenditure. It's capital revenue. That's correct. We pay interest on, and which would go towards rates. Yeah.
That's the end of your questions, Councillor? Thank you. Councillor Randall.
So, just following along from that, $3.3 million, if we don't gather that information, then we will be taking on debt. It won't, that will actually just be added to our debt.
Yeah, it would be similar to missing the mortgage payment on your house. You'll have to find another way to pay for it.
Okay.
I would say, however, we do have to remember that this is in a very uncertain construction market at the moment. It's a market that has considerable headwinds, but we also have headwinds ourselves in infrastructure provision. So you're being asked to make quite a difficult choice.
Okay, and so the other question I have in terms of this amendment, you've put this policy together based on a full set of criteria. Does this amendment align to those criteria? And if not, how far out of step would it be to essentially just pick a housing type and say they get a special dispensation?
So the core principle that sits behind development contributions is that growth will pay for its impacts. So in terms of remitting or not collecting that money, that's not consistent with that principle. However, you also have your city outcomes to think of, and you need to think about whether not charging them in the central city helps you achieve those outcomes, and whether that's worth that $3 million Michael mentioned.
So, in theory...
Just a reminder, councillors, you do need to look at me because otherwise I'll call on the next person. Off you go, another question.
Okay, sorry. Apologies, Chair.
No, all good.
We could, for example, pick another housing type and give them dispensation as well if we wish to, like, for example, medium density housing in the south.
So I would advise you to choose areas so that it aligns with catchments so that we can administer the policy more easily. I'd also be very careful about choosing a housing typology because it's quite difficult to determine what medium density is or what an apartment is in practice on the ground. Yes, I know apartments are off the ground, Madam Chair, but
Except for the ground floor.
You know, if you were to make an exemption for, say, a two-storey for, say, apartments, you might find that a whole lot of terrace houses get reclassified as very low apartment buildings. You've got to be quite careful of these policy perversions.
Thank you.
Councillor McNulty.
Just trying to think of some counterfactuals to see if this could stack up. So let's say 1,000 more units come onto the market, or apartment. 1,000 more rate-paying units come onto the market. Average rates bill 4,000. That's 4 million that would come in revenue. I mean, is there any kind of, I suppose, we've got this 3.3 down here. Is there any kind of counterfactual figure of what this could generate to offset that you could provide, or we're just completely in hypothetical la-la land?
I think it would be hypothetical, but also the rates, how they're distributed, it's not an income generating increase. It would just change how the distribution of rates would be applied. So if we had another 1,000 units, that just means that there's a marginal change in terms of how that total cost for the budget gets distributed across the number of ratepayers. So it wouldn't increase revenue for the council.
I'd also clarify, we've been talking a great deal about houses, but what these are charged against are EHUs, equivalent household units, so they do apply to businesses as well.
All right, just so you know, councillors, we're going to get through questions and then we'll take a break for morning tea and then we will move and debate on both the substantive and the amendment. Pauiwi Kelly?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm really sorry. I haven't sort of followed the background to this, but I'm struggling to understand what is the purpose of delaying this increase? Is there something that council hasn't got ready why we're doing this?
So I believe that will be a question for the mover.
Oh, okay. Right. And you're going to tell us why you wanted. Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Rogers.
Yeah, I guess my question was just, again, going back to sort of some of the advice that's coming out of the Infrastructure Commission in terms of the way that we do charge for growth, whether this would perhaps be inconsistent as what they're describing as best practice.
I haven't read all of the Infrastructure Commission's latest advice, but no, it doesn't seem consistent with that. With the idea that growth pays for growth. But you're also not bound to be consistent. I would say, however, that was a statement of fact, not criticism. The other thing I would say is that you're I've forgotten it now.
I'm sorry, Sean. I'm sorry. Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I guess my other question is, we're looking at this as a development contributions policy, and perhaps, I think it is slightly alluded to in the paper around what the most appropriate way is to provide subsidies and whether that's the LTP in our financial strategies. But I guess would there be a more efficient or more appropriate place to sort of apply something like this?
So you have a choice essentially between development contributions or rates. That's what it comes down to. I would say that throughout your submissions on Local Government Act reform, councils, for as long as I've served them, have been saying they have too limited a number of financial tools to do their work, and not deploying the tools you have does somewhat undermine that long-term position.
Councillor Chung.
Thanks very much, Sean. You've alluded to talking about the prediction for the next couple of years about development, and it's a bit of a tenuous market for any developer to be going out there. So have you had any discussions with any developers regarding development of any residential areas, and also secondly developments in the CBD?
So yes, I bump into developers all the time as I wander about the town, and there is considerable interest, particularly in the east of the city at the moment and in the CBD. However, people are naturally conservative given the interest rates, the uncertainty within the Wellington economy at the moment. And so we are still seeing developments proceed. However, the decisions that the people who are building are having to make are becoming more and more difficult for them to make.
Great. So do you think that these, sorry, can I follow? So when you distinguish between industrial commercial development and residential, do you find that there's any increase or decrease in the interest in either of those two?
I think we are moving somewhat outside of the scope of the paper.
Yep, okay. The reason for the question is that I also talk to developers regularly, and it seems that there's very little appetite for residential developments, which of course that would affect the development contributions that we would likely get if we were planning on expecting any, whereas there is more interest in commercial areas.
So that is where that equivalent household unit becomes important, because the reason it's called an equivalent household unit is it isn't a household unit. It is a ratio that is charged to commercial developments that's equivalent to a household. So from a council point of view, commercial buildings still attract development contributions through that ratio mechanism.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Oh, Councillor Brown, yes.
Sorry, this is to challenge you on the 3.3.
It's a question.
Our question is, am I right to understand that the developer contribution over the last 2 years has averaged in total 3.3, and therefore if we were to actually postpone the increase, and only postponing the increase on the central city, it would be a tiny fraction of 3.3, given that that is the average total that we've got in developer contributions?
Yeah, it's another hypothetical, and it's a really difficult one to calculate because, yes,
we're not. No, but sorry, we're getting 3.3 now.
Councillor, wait for an answer.
So we are getting 3.3 now.
Councillor,
Sorry.
wait for an answer.
So I think I can assist Michael. So the 3.3 is the current base in that equation, correct?
Yeah.
Correct.
And so what we are looking at is you would get your 3.3 over the next or 1.5 over the next year, given it's a 2-year figure, but we would forgo the money on top of that.
Correct.
But only on the central city part, yes.
And on the central city part, based on the projections for demand, which is the only information that we can reliably use at the moment, is that would be estimated to be 3.3. But I would, caveat that you could have a couple of large single developments that could, generate much more than that. We could have a large commercial development in the central city because it's charged on a per 100 metre squared basis. We could also receive income. So it's really lumpy, the amount of income that we actually receive. And we received about $7 million last year in development contributions, which is far greater than we've ever received, not on residential, not on central city, but the district plans unlocked a whole lot of opportunities for central city development that didn't exist previously as well. So we may anticipate more development in that space, and large apartment complexes could come, and that would generate a lot more development contribution revenue.
All right, thank you both. We are now going to break for morning tea, and we will come back at 1:45. on to the paper which is being moved by Councillor Rogers and seconded by myself. Over to you, Councillor Rogers.
Kia ora, colleagues. I'm very happy to move this paper. As some of you might know, in my spare time I like to read reports from the Infrastructure Commission, and I'm very glad to see that we are following some of the best practice advice that they have been putting out, specifically around the way that growth should pay for growth. I think the benefit of this should reach across the table, this development and contribution policy. For my colleagues who are concerned about efficiency and costings, this sends good price signals to the market about where they should be developing so that we can utilise our resources in the most effective way. And for my more climate conscious colleagues, you'll be relieved to hear that this does also, although not to the quantum that Deputy Mayor Foon might like, does send some signals around reducing people's reliance on significant roading assets in our construction of them. And I want to thank the officers for a lot of the work they have done, looking into what the benefits of a delay might be, and I'm sure many of that will come up in debate, but I just very much wanted to say that while I may have originally been persuaded by the argument that there would be great benefit from a delay, I have read the arguments provided by officers and I do tend to agree with them, particularly in light of the fact that making a development doesn't actually increase our rates take, it just changes the apportionment of it, and sort of coming towards that macroeconomic look of developments in the central city, the sort of difficulty of actually being able to predict the benefit of such delay at the cost of sending worse price signals to the market and having a less clean policy for our staff to administer. So with that, I'm happy to hear people's thoughts.
So, seconder, I'll reserve my right to speak. So we will move then to Councillor Brown to your amendment. We'll bring that up on the screen and we'll reset the timer so you can talk.
Thank you. I mean, as we're all aware, as we've discussed earlier this week, in fact, around this issue of working from home, which the government is bringing out the old sledgehammer as per usual. Obviously the central city is struggling at the moment thanks to working from home and apparently things like cycleways. But the only way we're going to be able to revitalise the central city of Wellington is by having more people living in the central city of Wellington. And by far our greatest relative advantage versus Auckland or Christchurch or anywhere else in New Zealand for that matter is the number of people we do have living in the central city. And it's a number that we need to work constantly to actually increase, because the more people we have living in the central city, the better for the central city and also the better for the environment. And what we're really competing with today are the very large developments which are occurring in places like Plimmerton and Upper Hutt and Porirua as well. So, in recent years where Wellington has been relatively restrictive around greenfield development, that greenfield development has happened in Kapiti and Lower and Upper Hutt. And what we need to do is to make sure that the central city, as a place for people to live, is both affordable and highly desirable. So the reason that I think that we originally postponed the developments policy from the LTP conversation was that a number of developers came to us back in, the particular letter I've got from one of them, which I've just brought along this morning, was that they were saying, look, I mean, if you do this policy, you are going to stifle development. And I think what we heard this morning, and certainly I spoke to two developers this morning, and one of them is more upper market and one of them is affordable market. And the upper market type developers, if you're selling an apartment for a couple of $1 million and you add $10,000 per apartment on, it's not a colossal difference to the affordability of the apartment for the sort of people who are looking to buy. But if you are looking at entry-level apartments, and the one developer in particular is looking very much at that entry-level apartment, $10,000 on an apartment that might be, if it's a small apartment, could be $500,000, or more of a two-bedroom, medium-sized apartment, $800,000. 10 grand makes quite a big difference. And so I look at the current situation that we're facing, which is of a very depressed residential development market where there is very little actually going on, and I feel that we should postpone the increase of the developer contribution on the central city for 18 months, to push it out to 1 July 2026, because hopefully next year the economy will start improving, low interest rates will start having a beneficial consequence, and we will start seeing an uptick. So this is a temporary...
3 minutes.
Sure, this is a temporary postponement. Now, as Michael said, we do have a policy of remissions, and I spoke to the developers about the remissions policy as well. And they said, yeah, sure, that is something which we can turn up and we can ask for the council to actually give us our money back effectively. But it adds a lot of uncertainty and adds a lot of complexity to the policy. Plus, I'm not a big fan of creating a sort of a handout type regime which then becomes kind of semi-permanent. I like the idea that we provide an 18-month postponement of the increase, which may or may not cost us anything depending on what actual development occurs over this period of time. Hopefully it does cost us something. In other words, hopefully it does bring some developments forward and we do see some buildings actually occur that wouldn't otherwise occur at that time frame. So I think it's important that we show that we are supporting the increasing population of central Wellington. I think it's important that we show that where we do really want development to occur, which is in central Wellington, that we are putting our money where our mouth is. I think we should do it on a temporary basis, hence the 18-month delay rather than some sort of subsidy regime and ongoing arrangement. And I think this could make a small difference in a very depressed market, and I think it's would be a good change for us to effectively sort of make it clear where we stand on these policies.
Councillor Bennett, you're seconding. Would you like to speak now?
Briefly, I just grumpily said to the officer at morning tea, how much did this cost us to review this policy? Because it's not much in it. This is a serious point. There weren't many changes made. So there wasn't, and so it was a friendly comment. I'm probably being a little bit, just really wanting to see some more efficiency with the way we use our time and our money because we've got such big costs, and that's just one way around it. I'm just very briefly happy to support this. I have been consistent about trying to get rates remission to help people. This is just a sort of another form of it. So we'll see if it works. Thanks for just coming up with something that will provide a bit of temporary relief. Kia ora.
Councillor Free.
Yeah, so I'm not going to be supporting this because I do think we need a clean, simple policy. In terms of officer time, Councillor Bennett, my understanding is that administering something like this would actually be quite complicated and lead to quite a lot of extra officer time. And as you say, the quantum that we're talking about is not huge. I don't believe that $10,000 will make a crucial difference to whether a development goes ahead or not. And I actually think we've got to start getting realistic about who's paying for what in this city. It does cost money when we have extra development, and that's fine. That's as it should be. But it also, we do have a policy that it should be paid for by the new development itself. I think that we are in a crisis situation with our budget, and we actually need to be very cold and clear about how we're collecting our money, have really transparent, simple rules about it, and just stick to them. So I won't be supporting this. I understand the intention, but I won't be supporting it.
Councillor Chung.
Well, I have to say that Councillor Free has actually just stolen my thunder because that was pretty much what I was going to say. I too talk to developers often, and I don't know if we're talking, Councillor Brown and I are actually talking to the same developers because the feedback that I'm getting from them is that development contributions are a tiny, tiny part of the cost of any development that they do, and they've never actually consider that 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 is actually within the wiggle room of any negotiation that they actually have in a sale of an apartment. So that they said that, sure, they're quite happy to actually not have any expenses to pay to the council, but they don't think it'll make any difference. So, thank you.
Just want a quick reminder about time. That we have sort of all said that we, so I've got a speaking order, but I just want to emphasise that we don't all have to speak on everything. Councillor Panovich.
I would like to speak on this. I am going to support this, and I think the reason is I've heard a lot in the last week from developers as well. Probably not the same ones that Ray talks to, but it is an issue. And the other focus that we have quite significantly at the moment is the rates differential in the city as well. So if there is an ability for us to create some form of development versus no development, because if there's no development, we get nothing. I'm in favour of that. And I think if it happens at the process, the time when we're actually doing a lot of development, that is actually quite beneficial for the city as well, because there will be an end point. And the phrase we hear eternally for this last few months is survive to 2025. So if we can create some stimulus within the developer community to actually bring projects forward and to have activity, I'm in support of that. Thank you.
Councillor Rogers.
I'm happy to reserve just to expedite things. Okay, yeah, I was just going to say some of my reading of the sort of, I guess, more academic interpretations of development contributions policies and when we lack to have them, is that what it does do is create a wealth transfer from every resident in a city to private developers, and the ability for private developers to capture that wealth transfer is based purely on how good they are at negotiating with the market to purchase the house. So in many cases, this would be a subsidisation for the profit margins of said developers rather than actually being passed through to first home buyers in what I would consider to be a meaningful way that doesn't negatively impact the rest of the city.
Councillor Calvert.
I think Councillor Rogers said what I'm going to say a bit more eloquently. But actually, at the end of the day, we're getting people writing to us telling us about our rates increase. Individual people on fixed incomes that can't even afford now to pay for the necessities, and we want to give away more money when we don't even know what this is going to cost. And far be it for me to call Councillor Brown irresponsible, even though he does that to me on occasions with my amendments. But really, to put this forward and not actually understand the impact on our rates, and a couple of $1 million might seem insignificant to some, but I tell you what, to a lot of people out there, it means a hell of a lot of money. And when it adds to their rates, and they have no choice about what gets funded of something like this, no wonder people are concerned about where we're spending our money or where we're putting our money. So, and also, how do we know this is going to make the difference? We haven't. Everything we come up with these piecemeal ideas. If we really want to do something about our central city, then have a coordinated, a cohesive plan. But we don't. We just think, oh, that's a good idea. I'll save some developer $10,000 a property that they're charging $1.2 million for. So, look, I just can't support that, and I'm disappointed it's even been brought forward at this late stage. Thank you.
Councillor Brown, right of reply? Oh, sorry, Councillor McNulty.
Yeah, always find myself worried when I'm in rapid and frantic agreement with absolutely everything Councillor Brown is saying. But today it is such a day, and I looked at what I tweeted earlier in the week, where getting more people living in the CBD rather than returning to forced office hours is where we need to head. So it's a little bit. I guess the argument has convinced me in this from Councillor Brown. Yes. The addition of 1,000 new rating units, and I'm making that number up, doesn't add any more revenue, but it certainly means for future rate increases that pool is being divided over a larger pool of ratepayers, and at the end of the day, that marginal cost is the only way we ever get the budget of the city substantially in a better trajectory in the long term, is by having a broader and larger rating space. So look, I can see where the vote's going on this anyway, but Councillor Brown, I'm actually going to be with you today.
I'm going to speak briefly to just explain why I'm going to vote against this amendment, and I have made my feelings known to Councillor Brown about the timeliness of it. I think if you do want support of your colleagues, it would be helpful if we could get things with more time and have an opportunity for more discussion. Nobody supports increased housing in our city, probably more than me, and that's why I voted for significant upzoning to occur as part of the district plan. But actually, the advice that we have had is this: it's very likely to have very little impact on the overall numbers of housing development that we see in this period of time. And I just, the comments being made about the transferal of wealth are have been quite influential on me, and I hear what the developers are saying. I want to support them. I want to create an enabling environment, but actually I would rather do that on a case-by-case basis where it is necessary rather than have a blanket subsidisation. Councillor Randall.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to say that I'm not going to support this. I'm not a believer in picking winners, and I'm not a believer in handouts to particular groups unless there's a very compelling reason. And I don't think Councillor Brown has put a compelling reason why this group of housing is and the developers for it are especially under special pressure compared to all the other developers that are trying to build houses all throughout the city. I think all developers at the moment are trying to survive to 25, as Councillor Panovich said. And I don't think that, I'm for housing being built anywhere where it's economic. But I also think that the new pressure that developments do need to pay their way. And the development contributions is not even really covering the infrastructure costs we're going to have to spend to support these developments, but they've got to have their contribution. So I also note that under the criteria that's been outlined in our development contributions, the central city does get a lot of contribution from the whole city. Most of the parks in the central city area, most of the transport in the city central area is being contributed by all developments across the whole city. Now, there is reasons for that, but it is of note that the central city does get help from the rest of the city, and it doesn't necessarily work in reverse, as outlined in Granada North Lincolnshire Farm. So I'm going to vote against this because I'm not really into the picking winners, and the comments around the Chair made around late amendments I actually also support, because with a little more thought, and maybe we could have had a different outcome. Thanks.
Pauiwi Kelly.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I have to say that I've swayed backwards and forwards through the whole discussion, so it's been really helpful. But where I've landed is that I support growth, that any growth that you pay for the impacts. So I do support throughout our DCs, through our development contributions, and I've been quite strong in the past about us being consistent about how much we pay for the when we've had a couple of people who have come and we've waived that DC, and I just thought that we were setting a precedent. However, I also support inner city development, and from what I've heard is that that any impact isn't going to be huge, but if we can provide an opportunity that might stimulate that, I'm supportive of that. And when you're talking about taking away the pūtea, we need to remember that we're already getting the contribution. What we're talking about is the increase. That's correct. So it's the increase. So I'm going to support this amendment.
Councillor Brown, right of reply.
Thank you. First up, I'd just like to apologise for the very late delivery of this. I am quite remorseful about that. So, and I'm sure if I had more time, I would have persuaded more of you to the wisdom of this move. I guess it's true to say that I don't think that the officers that we had before us or any of the people I've spoken to, and I mean I've only spoken to 2 developers, and I don't think anyone is able to promise anything in terms of what's $10,000 per apartment. So it is very problematic as to exactly what the financial impact of this is. But it was very clear from one of the developers, who was one of the main reasons why we actually postponed the policy back in when we did the LTP. And this was a particular development, which is the corner of Tory and Vivian Street. is that when you looked at the numbers, and he was very explicit about the numbers, that effectively the extra $1 million that we're going to levy on his property would make an appreciable difference in terms of the affordability of those apartments that he was looking to sell for first-time buyers. And first-time buyers are very constrained in terms of they tend to, they've got LVRs and they have the interest rates, and at the moment there's a lot of headwinds, which is why the first-time people are struggling to buy in the city. This particular developer is doing terrace-type developments around the city, so he's got 30 developments occurring in suburbs. So he is able to do suburban developments, but at the moment he's not doing anything central city, and that seems to be the story that I've heard from the other developer I heard as well. So in all probability, whether we do the postponement or whether we do the policy immediately, I don't think it probably makes a very great deal of difference. And as Michael told us before, there are ways that people can actually ask for remissions, which we may or may not provide. But I think it's a shame if we don't send a signal to developers that we would, and to Wellingtonians, or prospective Wellingtonians, that we would like them to live in the central city. So I feel like this was actually, it was a more symbolic gesture in favour of encouraging development in the central city. And the hope, as Councillor Panovich said, that we would see the market in general recover over the next 18 months, in which case this policy or this postponement of these extra charges would become irrelevant. So I'd hope you could support it, because I think that it is a symbolic gesture on behalf of Council, which I think is quite important in terms of our long-term aspiration about people living in the central city. It may or may not have made or would make any difference, but if it did, it would be to that affordable end of the market, and that is also where I would like us to see development actually occurring.
All right, we will go to the vote. I just want to say how much I enjoyed the multiple uses of the term causal nexus. I'm going to name my death metal band Causal Nexus. Right. No, it's the amendment. We're just voting on the amendment.
A division as well, please.
We can have a division. I think we're going to see some interesting voting combinations here. For fans of quirky political outcomes. That is lost. And Councillor Brown has given us a commitment. He will give us a lot more notice in future. Right, we move back to the substantive. Is there any further debate on the substantive? There does not seem to be any. Would you like a right of reply, Councillor Rogers? We will go to the vote on the substantive. That has carried. All right, now we move on to item 2.2, the annual plan directive and approach. It says Andrew Reeves on my paper, but it's going to be Baz and Lloyd, isn't it? To come. Oh, and Rainer. I said, sorry, I couldn't control my happiness about being Rainer as well. Welcome, and I'll give it to you to introduce the report.
Good morning, councillors. We do have a short presentation. And the reason being is an annual plan process is pretty straightforward, and that's what this is, and largely covered off in the paper. But of course, there's a few matters coming up in the next month or so that may result in an LTP amendment. So I thought it'd be good to talk through what happens in terms of process. So what we'll just do is we'll go through that. We'll just show you the standard annual plan process, the purpose of it, talk a little bit through the key issues, when they're going to be considered, and then if an LTP amendment emerges, what that process looks like in terms of timelines and resourcing and such. So the purpose of an annual plan is, in essence, you'll know all of this, is actually to talk about year 2 of the long-term plan. And the reality is if you don't actually make any changes, the level of engagement and work is actually quite low. So quite a few councils around New Zealand actually, they don't go out for consultation, they just issue their funding impact statements and annual plan once they've made their decisions. Now we've got close to that a couple of times, but we've never been able to manage it. We've always had a range of variances that we take out for community engagement. So there are some potential variances that will be of no surprise to you. So they're all coming up in October in terms of decisions. So you've got the notice of motion on the airport, you've got water reform coming up in late October, and you've also got the NZTA funding shortfall, so that's in late October as well. It's not the purpose of this paper and at this stage to talk through whether they will trigger an amendment or not. Those individual papers will cover those matters off, and they'll be using the significance and engagement policy to make those kind of decisions. Similarly, we kind of have to turn our mind to what happens with consultation. Obviously. The significance and engagement policy determines whether it's an LTP amendment, but also the other thing that we will turn our mind to in due course, not today, but is whether we bring them all together into the annual plan. Generally, what our starting point for everything is what makes sense to the community if we're going to have a consultation. Is it worth having separate consultations, or is it worth bringing everything together? And because of all the issues, or all the matters have some level of funding or budget component to them, it probably will make sense, if an LTP amendment is triggered, is to bring them all together. Obviously, an LTP amendment and an annual plan might not look very different from your perspective, but they are quite different in terms of layers of complexity. You do actually have different parts of the legislation that guide you in terms of having to have a statement of proposal. The special consultative procedure comes into play during consultation, so you can't do engagement, it's consultation. And more so in terms of timeframes, we also have to have it audited. So we have to build timeframes into the process to allow for audit to carry out their work. What's in front of you is a pretty standard annual plan process. You've got this in your papers. In essence, we tend to kick off around about now. This is the first paper on the annual plan. We have a range of budgeting modules that we go through. We take those to you for consideration in November, talk through any variances and budget changes, and in essence start making some of the higher level big decisions in December. That's followed by formal deliberations in February, engagement, hearings, and so on and so forth, with final decisions in June in terms of the annual plan and striking the rates. So what are the differences? So these are the three matters that are currently ahead of us in terms of matters that may impact the annual plan process, and that impact could just be variances to the annual plan, but potentially some of them could be a trigger to an LTP amendment as well. So just in terms of when they're being considered, currently in the program 10 October on the notice of motion, NZTA funding shortfalls 29 October, and then Three Waters reform is 31 October. And as I previously mentioned, you know, should an LTP amendment be triggered, we'd be considering strongly whether we bring everything together into one conversation with the community, because there are budget impacts across all three. So if that were to happen, the front end, in essence, doesn't change too drastically. Obviously, you got the decisions in December. There would be obviously additional works and complexities. We'd have to work with audit and get them organised. You'd still have deliberations. You'd make your major decisions in December as much as possible. Formal deliberations in February. But then we would have to, and I apologise, it is a bit small on the screen, so I will flick this presentation out later. But we'd have to build in time for audit after Christmas. So that just basically means we need to find 4 to 5 weeks in the time frame from February to June, which makes everything quite tight. It is doable, but everything becomes quite tight. So that's the main change. And of course, you move from engagement to consultation under the special consultative procedure. So that's just a high-level quick snapshot. I thought it'd be useful for you all to see the difference between an annual plan process and an LTP process. And I'll leave it there and take any questions.
Can I ask that? I just wanted to ask a question about the where the water paper was coming, because my understanding was it was coming to a committee of the whole. I didn't know if it had been determined yet, but according to that presentation, it's going to council.
I thought it was going on the 29th of October.
Yes, yeah. So we maybe can clarify that offline and provide an email advice about that.
Yes, that's no problem. Sorry, I copied the dates from the paper, and I think the paper was completed before some time ago, and I think some subsequent changes have been made. So
Thank
yes.
you. Thank you. Councillor Calvert.
In June, this council agreed to set out proposals within the next 6 months for how the council would achieve all planned operating expenditure without debt funding. I couldn't see that in the paper.
It's not specifically in the paper, but it is something that we will be bringing back as part of this annual plan to understand what the impact would be from not further debt funding any operating expenditure.
So I wonder whether we could have that built into the process. I mean, I'm happy to move an amendment, but I would like to explicitly see that there so it's not forgotten about.
That can be brought to the November workshop and then again in the December paper as well.
So you will include that in any amended stuff going forward. That would be great. And could we also have this presentation tabled as part of the public documentation as well? That would be helpful. Thank you.
Councillor Chung.
Thanks very much. I just want just a point of clarification. You're saying that the difference, or one of the differences between the long-term plan and the annual plan, is that the long-term plan needs to be audited by Audit New Zealand, correct?
Correct.
Yep. And the annual plan, any annual plan changes, or any annual plan don't.
Annual plans don't. No, they don't get audited. So that you've got more time, and LTPs and LTP amendments do need to be audited. Yep.
Great. Thank you.
And actually, I meant to do a reminder before we move into these questions, but and so far they've been perfect. But it's questions of process, and the content of those particular matters will come back to us in those. So any kind of thing that delves into the content of the annual plan or those particular issues that have been highlighted to us, we will need to wait for more information. Councillor Free.
Yeah, so my question is really about the supposing there is a decision not to proceed with the airport sales and that has a direct impact on our financial strategy. Would that mean that we would have to look at bringing the process forward for the LTP amendment, or would we just sit on the knowledge that we're, that there's a major change coming forward, but we just have to sit on that for a few months?
Well, in essence, we will get an understanding in terms of whether the airport notice of motion triggers an LTP amendment later in early October, 10 October. So the decision at that point will guide us in terms of whether an LTP amendment is on the table or not.
But it doesn't change the time frame.
No, so we would switch to an LTP timeframe, and like I said before, the first couple of months of the annual plan and the LTP are reasonably in sync. What we have to build into the process, certainly from an audit perspective, is more, 3 to 4 weeks at least for audit to do their work in February, March, and then again once in late May and June.
Just further to what Baz has just said, Councillor, it also increases a considerable amount of pressure and complexity into the process. While the timeframe remains the same, you've got a lot more hoops to get through as you go through, and remembering you are then operating under the special consultative procedure itself. So you have a whole lot of additional things, such as a consultation document which has to be audited and so on. So there is a lot of complexity which starts to get built in as you move through that whole process.
can I ask another question? Is that complexity more than the complexity that we know we're going to face from the water, the water changes and maybe the transport changes?
Yes, I mean, I think if what we're saying is if an LTP amendment is triggered, then it's logical to bring all those conversations together into one LTP amendment, and that would be quite a substantial amendment.
Okay.
Councillor Randall.
Yes, I'm still quite confused about the water, the relationship between the water consultation and the significance policy, because you outlined that these amendments would all be influenced by the significance policy, but it's my understanding that the water consultation is actually specifically exempted from the significance policy, so it doesn't necessarily have to come through a long-term plan amendment. Can you just clarify that?
Yes, you're correct. So the water reforms or the changes to the water have got their own set of legislation. They're being worked through by the lawyers, but yes, they're exempt from the special consultative procedure. And so if no LTP amendment is triggered by NZTA or through the notice of motion, the water process would run its own course, and an LTP amendment is not required until the end of the process.
Right, no, thank you. Secondly, just with respect to paragraph 19, it talks about rates growth increase of 11.4%, excluding the sludge levy. Can we continue the approach that we agreed in the long-term plan of always including the sludge levy amount? Because in reality, the sludge levy amount is also an amount that's payable by all ratepayers. That's what they see on their bill.
Yes, we'll make sure to include the sludge levy as well on top of that.
Okay, and one more. And finally, in paragraph 18, it talks about maintaining the council's self-imposed debt to revenue ratio of 225%. It's my understanding that the council's self-imposed debt to revenue ratio limit is actually 225% minus $272 million for the insurance debt headroom.
That's correct. So the debt to revenue ratio that was set through the financial strategy and is legislatively required is 225%, and the decision was made on the 31st of May to include the insurance headroom of $272 million for the full 10 years. So as part of that, we considered and put in the headroom over those 10 years. The 225% debt to revenue limit remains still. It's just inclusive of the headroom.
Yes, it's just very confusing in terms of it being clear that the annual plan will be reported against the actual limit, which is the self-imposed limit, which is 225% minus $272 million. So can we be sure that that's actually the limit that's going to be reported against?
The limit will be the 225% inclusive of the insurance headroom.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor O'Neill.
I just wanted to check in, as many other authorities are kind of trying to keep up with government reforms. Is there a part of the annual plan process that the government is giving local government sector an extension to local authorities like they did with long-term plan?
No.
No. Oh, good.
Councillor Free, you had another question?
I did. I guess my question was around, again, looking at when we trigger an LTP amendment. So the water on its own doesn't trigger the LTP amendment because of special circumstances. It's the transport costs. How significant are they likely to be? Can we manage them by rearranging budgets and reprioritisation, or are the transport on their own likely to trigger?
I think you're getting into the content question about what will happen in the October the 29th paper. So I think you're
But we are talking about it. We are sort of talking about the kind of overview of it. Can I have an officer advice on how likely those additional transport costs are to trigger an LTP amendment on their own?
I think we need to do that work, and that's the point that the 29th of October paper will bring back, and so we'll provide that assessment for you then.
Okay, so there's no kind of overview at this point?
Not at this point.
Not at this stage.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, team. That seems to be the end of the questions. I will move this paper and Mayor Whanau will second. I don't think it requires a lot of, well, from my perspective, it does not require a lot of debate at this point. Obviously, we will make decisions. We are making decisions in what I will positively frame as a dynamic environment. And there's some dynamism both on our side and some dynamism on the central government side. And so we are all just going to have to continue to make the best decisions we can at the time that we have with the information that we have. So I just want to thank the team for all the work that has just gone into an LTP and that continues under especially government policy reform that we will have to grapple with. Do you wish to speak? Okay, and any debate, councillors? Councillor Calvert.
I mean, the recommendations here is basically just receiving the information and noting lots of different things. But I think, as we've said, and as the chair said, there is a dynamic situation, and so I'd hate to think that all these notes actually specify exactly how we're proceeding. And so because of that, it's plainly obvious that we are not probably going to do a normal annual plan. There is going to be some significant changes no matter what gets passed or doesn't get passed over the next week or so, or next month or so. I'm interested about the interim inflation rates, really. I mean, we should have known where they were heading back when we did the LTP, and to now sort of look at those being higher, it does surprise me. I won't be supporting 5. Note the intention to provide a draft annual plan budget. I mean, we really need to have a new long-term plan budget. So I'm not going to support that. I'm not going to note, I mean, I know it's only a noting, but it's actually supporting that it's business as usual, and it's not business as usual. The ground is moving very quickly around us. So, and that's really just a signal to say, look, I don't know why this has been brought to us at this point for us to actually make a decision when everything is so up in the air. Thank you.
It doesn't look like there's any further debate. I guess I just want to note that we do have to make decisions, even if they are just noting ones, as we go. And the first people to complain about if we didn't have information brought to us in a timely way about the process and how we move forward would be the people around this table. So I think it is valuable that while noting that things are likely to change, that we continue with the process that we are obliged to do under law as methodically, calmly, with goodwill and constructively as we can. So I'd urge you to vote for all of these recommendations and look forward to working with you to deliver the annual plan and any other changes that are required. Five separately, Councillor Calvert? 0.5 and then the rest?
And I'll call for a division as well, please. Thank you.
That is carried, and we will move on to vote on all the other items. Thank you.
It is a bit of a muddle though, isn't it, really?
That is carried. All right, we'll move on to item 2.3, the decision register updates and upcoming reports. Andrea.
I'll take the paper as read.
Questions? Councillor Randall.
Yes, could you please explain what the Te Tau Mahana quarterly report is, please, about?
It's been answered in the Q&A, Councillor.
Is it? Oh, sorry.
Yep. Thank you. Are there any other questions? I will move the paper. Councillor Panovich will second. Councillor Randall.
Yeah, I'd just like to note that having programs that aren't self-explanatory in their forward program is very confusing for people outside the council. And I just ask again that officers please think about this when they are preparing the schedule for publication so that people know what's coming up for this council. Thanks.
Councillor Free.
Can we please table the Q&A for this entire agenda and have it attached to the minutes, please?
Absolutely. I would like to give a right of reply and just say that I had answered Councillor Randall's question about what the Te Toi Mahana quarterly report was, and to say that Te Toi Mahana is the community housing provider established by council, and that I would expect all councillors to be aware of the name of that organisation, and if they are not aware of the name of that organisation, there may be a quicker way of getting that information than putting it in the Q&A, and that probably would apply to any other name of a work program that also contains Māori words. We'll go to the vote. That is carried. We are now going to move to go into public excluded for the reasons that we are protecting the privacy of individuals. I will move. Councillor Panovich will second. Is there any debate? There appears to be none. We will vote on that. That is carried. We'll just take a second to make sure the live stream is turned off. Tēnā kua mutu te hui, me karakia tātou. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapanui. Kia wātia, kia mama, te nāko, te tinana, te wairua. E te arataka tū, koe ara e rongo. Whakairia ākikironga. Kia wātia, ai rā kua wātia. Thank you, and finish well before lunchtime.